snails like that, 120-year-old roads that were built by hand, and we'd pass through Whangarei to get there. We would always stop off at Melville and Ellis, and we knew that there was a hot Milo there, and Merv would get that going, so we'd leave early so we could get that on time. I think he had a bit of a crook working for him in the name of David, his son, but David wasn't often there working, but Merv certainly was. And we'd pass on through, and I just remember heading up to Kaikoui Church, came to Whangarei Church quite a few times when we were young. I've been on your motorbike rides. The church is strong for that, but I also just looked to the right, and it's been 35 years since I attended Papakura Church, and I know I'm going to make a fool of myself if I get this wrong, but is it Isabel? I haven't seen you in 35 years, the mother of Lisa. And I've been in touch with Lisa on Facebook, but it's been 35, 36 years. And I see the same smiling face, and I don't think you've aged literally in 36 years. And I look around, and that's why I say friends. So thank you, Adrian, for offering up the pulpit. It's a bit of a hard gig, isn't it, when Adrian's the pastor and you've got to come and preach when Adrian's on next week. You've got one of the best parts of the North Island, I think. So, you're very fortunate, I believe, up here in Whangarei, so thank you for the warm welcome. I guess for me personally, I'm not a preacher. What I do enjoy doing is sharing the word. I think when it comes from here, we can't go too far wrong. And I guess what I would like to do this morning, I'm better when we dialogue, and I know that isn't going to happen this morning. But for me, the dialogue works. But we're going to go to Luke 15 and take another look at an old story, but from a new view. We all know Luke 15 takes us into the prodigal son, doesn't it? And I suppose sitting here looking around, I'm jumping to a conclusion that there's a lot of sons that have been either born in this church, a lot of daughters that have been born in this church, or we are a son or a daughter. Which means what we're going to share this morning and the way that Jesus shared the story is probably applicable to every person here. You know, we're living in a world, aren't we, where there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of hurt, there's a lot of suffering. 8 people, I think, were shot at the FedEx distribution centre. Was it FedEx or DHL yesterday? And we think 8 people died. Oh, well, that's in America. You know, that's a little bit of bad luck. But I went to visit a friend of mine last week, which I hadn't seen in 3 or 4 months. He was diagnosed with bowel cancer, 54, in November. His age is 54. He's got another month to live. He's lost 40 kilos. And for him and his family, it's real because it's him. You know, my daughter, you may have all heard in the news, there was a lady in Australia last Friday, as in a week ago, 8 days ago Friday, went to get her COVID injection. Now, this isn't a political statement, this isn't about COVID, I'm not like that, but she went and got her injection. She died on Thursday. Now, what makes it real? It was in the news, it was in the Herald yesterday morning, it was right through the Aussie papers yesterday morning. What makes it real is she worked at Sanitarium, and my daughter, who just got a job there 3 months ago, sat at the same desk with her every day for the last 3 months. And there is pain, there's hurt. Our daughter, she was in tears for 2 days, and this was just a friend, let alone the family. And I think in a world of pain, of suffering, of hurt, it's always good to share some hope, isn't it? It's always good to sort of know that there's a plan, that there is some hope. But death can come very quickly in a moment's notice. And I think in times like these, it's really, really good to be able to share the good news of the gospel. And the gospel is good news. Amen. And if you think you're sharing the gospel, and it's not good news to the person that's listening to it, it's not the gospel, and it's not good news. And too often, I think we try to share the good news of the gospel. We go to Revelation first. We go to the mark of the beast first. We go to the 2,300-day prophecy first. But is that necessarily good news to go to first? And I think the story this morning we're going to share, and it's not good news, but in context, I think it's great when we can communicate with these individuals that we bump into on a daily basis. I work for ADRA International. So my boss is up in Washington. I haven't been travelling too much lately. For those who don't know, ADRA International is the Adventist Development Relief Agency, and we get to see a lot of things. We had people in our office who actually have had COVID. We've had people in our office who have died and had parents that have died. And you get to see a lot of things when you're there. Now, we've just had our Indonesia country manager come back 2 weeks ago with his wife Di, and his wife's name is Diane. She's been diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. She was medevaced back to New Zealand. This has all happened in the last few weeks. So there is pain, there is hurt, there is suffering, but there is good news. With that, let's go to Luke 15. Now, I'm not sure whether it can be pulled up on the screen. I'm not sure how all that works, so I'm going to speak slowly. I'll give you guys the verse as well in advance. I've already seen how fast you work on the wrong hymn, getting that up so quickly, so it looks like you've got a great team here. But let's go to Luke 15. And normally when we go to Luke 15 for the prodigal son, we start at verse 11, don't we? Now, the other thing is, I had another Bible that I've used for a long time. The cover fell off it this week, so I grabbed this Bible, and the writing's half the size. So, and I'm double the age. So, let's see how we go when it comes to reading this out. But often we go to verse 11, and he said. It starts off, and he said, a certain man had 2 sons. In some version, it says, and he continued. So the prodigal son story doesn't start at verse 11 if he continued, or if he said. It starts before this. So if we go back to verse 8, and there's a little piece there that talks about the lost coin. Or what woman if she has 10 silver coins and loses one? So there's a story about some coins. But the story of the coins is only a continuation of the first story of Luke 15. And the first story of Luke 15 starts off in verse 4. What man among you, if he has 100 sheep and has lost one of them, does not leave the 99 in the open pasture? So now we've got a story of the prodigal son, which comes from a story of 10 coins, which comes from a story of 100 sheep. But I think verse 1 and 2 is the key to chapter 15 as we get into this. It gives context. It gives a picture of Jesus. It gives a picture of who he was talking to. So if you don't mind, I'd like to start off for the parable of the prodigal son in Luke 15:1. Now all the tax gatherers and the sinners were coming near him to listen to him. Who was him? We're clear on that? It's Jesus, isn't it? And both the Pharisees and the Scribes began to grumble, saying, this man receives sinners and eats with them. Who here spends every day eating with sinners, communicating, spending time with sinners? This is the Jesus that we profess to follow. This is what he did. This is who he hung out with. So when he told these stories, he had the people in mind who he was speaking to. Now we've got tax gatherers, we've got sinners. What are sinners made up of when it comes to sinners? You know, there's a number of different explanations. I mean, we had Mary Magdalene, who was a prostitute. We had, of course, Matthew the tax collector. We had Zacchaeus. We had a number of people who had a number of occupations, and they would follow Jesus and listen to him. He had something about him if they would follow and listen to every word that he said. We also have the Pharisees and the Scribes. Now, who were the Pharisees and the Scribes of the day that were following Jesus? Were they following him for the same purpose? They were trying to pull him down. They were trying to make excuses. They were trying to actually put motive on his action. And we know how that ended up. They actually wanted to kill him. But the Pharisees and the Scribes began to grumble. Now, the Pharisees and Scribes were from where? The local church of the day? The synagogues? The churches where everyone went, where you had to look good, you had to dress right, you had 780 rules on Sabbath, what you can and can't do. And all they were saying was, this man receives sinners and eats with them. So then he moves on to the stories that we're going to move on to, knowing who was listening. So he tells the first story, doesn't he, in verse 4. What man among you, if he has 100 sheep and has lost one of them, does not leave the 99 in the open pasture and go after one which is lost until he finds it? When he's found it, he lays it on his shoulders, rejoicing. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and his neighbours, saying to them, Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep which was lost. Then he says, I tell you that in the same way there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. That's his first story. What's the percentage of one sheep on 100? 1%. So we've actually got a percentage here as well. He starts off talking about one that was lost out of 100. 1%. You know, if you had $100 and you lost $1, you know, you sort of, yes, it was important with the sheep, but it's not so important in the overall picture of things because you've still got 99 left. He then moves on to the lost coin. 1 out of 10. What was the percentage of 1 out of 10? We go from 1%, we go to 10%. He's moving forward. He even includes not just a farmer who was a male, obviously, but a woman who's possibly a widow who now has coins. That's her value, that's her wealth. And he now involves a woman in the discussion. And he talks about, once again, if she lost it and she found it, what would she do? She would tell her friends, they would rejoice and they'd have a party. There's a celebration after each of the finds. So he goes from 1 in 100, 1%. He then goes from 1 out of 10, 10%. And then he moves on and he says, a certain man had 2 sons. What's the percentage when 1 out of 2 goes? A certain man had 2 sons. Now, what were sons to a father in these days? They worked the farm. They also had the prodigy. They had the children that moved forward. They were protection back in these days. When we read through with Joseph, Jacob, Abraham, you know, Abraham had, 318 men trained in the art of war. Abraham had a household of over 1,000 people inside of just his household. You needed protection back in these days. If someone came to take your sheep, you wanted to make sure that you had a team that could actually protect you, look after you. And what we've got, a certain man had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the estate that falls to me. And he divided his wealth between them. What do we see just in these first 2 verses? We see 2 sons. We're told one of them is younger. It's the younger one that actually wants to leave. And he says to his dad, what? Give me my share of the estate. Now in Deuteronomy we're told how succession worked. The older son got double the portion so he could look after the mother and the daughters. The younger son wasn't even really entitled to anything, let alone before dad died. What's he actually saying to his father when he says, Dad, I want my share now and I'm off? He's saying, I wish you were dead. Early on, the young boy. And what does the father actually do? The father gives him some share of the property, doesn't he? Who funded the journey of this young boy as he moves off in verse 13? And not many days later, the younger son gathered everything together and went on a journey into a distant country, and there he squandered his estate with loose living. Who funded this journey? Who gave him the money to go on this journey? Now, I know that we don't like to say this out loud, but let me open this up for you. The father gave him his share of the inheritance. The father knew where he was going. The father knew what he was going to do, yet the father did it. Now, I want you to turn with me, please, to Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 21, 17 to 23. Let's go to Deuteronomy 21, 17 to 23. I'd like to show you something. So that's Deuteronomy 21. Sorry, it's taking me a little longer to get there myself. Deuteronomy 21, 17 to 23. But if he shall acknowledge the firstborn, the son of the unloved, by giving him a double portion of all that he has, for he is the beginning of his strength, to him becomes the right of the firstborn. So there's a little bit there about the double portion goes to the oldest son. What's more important is verse 18. If any man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey his father or his mother, when they chastise him, he will not even listen to them. Then his father and mother should seize him and bring him out to the elders of the city at the gateway of his hometown. They shall say to the elders of the city, the son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey us. He's a glutton and a drunkard. Then all of the men of the city shall stone him to death. So you shall remove the evil from your midst, and all Israel shall hear of it and fear. What was Moses' law for a rebellious son? If we take the word of God, death. A rebellious son who was a drunken glutton should be stoned to death. Did the father take him to the gates? Do you think the Jews knew this when they heard the story? Did they know the laws and the books of Moses? They knew exactly what happens when Jesus is telling the story. When the father actually funds the son's journey, but also doesn't take him to the gates to be stoned, what is the father taking on himself? The sins of the son? The father should have had him stoned by the law of Moses, and the Jews knew that. What did the father actually do? Now, sorry, I've just got to go back to Luke 15. I'll put my little doggy mark in there now. Here we go. It's also very interesting that one of the words here, if we go back to the original Greek on wealth in verse 12, and he divided his wealth between them. So the father divides the wealth. The word wealth actually comes from the original Greek word bios, or biography. So while we think of money here, there's also the biography of the father, the story of the father, his life, the duration of, meaning and manner of life. So when the son takes the wealth and goes to blow it, yes, it's money, yes, it's cash. It's also the biography of the father, what his father taught him, the way that his father lived his life, the way that God had blessed his life. So when the son took this wealth and squandered it, he didn't just squander money. He squandered the life of the father, his upbringing, his father's relationship in the word bios, which is very, very interesting. When we go to divided, the word divided, if we go to the original Greek on the word divided in verse 12, it comes from dario or dia, which means to separate, distribute, divide and take, but also to seize and to grasp. Are you seeing what's happening here? He takes the bios, the biography of the father. He doesn't just take a distribution, he seizes it, he grasps it, and then he heads on his journey. Does that show you a picture of what the son had of the father at that time? So let's go to verse 14. Now when he had spent everything, a severe famine occurred in the country, and he began to be in need. And he went and attached himself to one of the citizens of that country, and he sent him into the fields to feed swine. And he was longing to fill his stomach with the pods that the swine were eating, and no one was giving anything to him. He blows it. He blows everything. In a far and distant land, he's now attached himself to a stranger. This stranger has no goodwill for the boy. This stranger has no interest in his life. In fact, he's not eating anything. A famine hits. What is a famine? A famine is a lack of what? Bread and water. A famine means there's nothing to eat and nothing to drink. When you contrast the famine in the land to his father's place where there was living water and the bread of life, he had living water. The bread of life was bestowed on him daily, spiritually. Let's spiritualize this. He's now in a land far away, and all they ever did was feed the kids carob pods, and these carob pods were indigestible to him. And he's sitting here. He's longing for something to eat. Now, what's another thing in verse 16? What was a pig or swine in Jewish culture? Did the Jews eat pigs and swine? No, they didn't. They were unclean. So you've got this boy who's left his father, left the household as a prince. Now he's at the lower, there's no sheep, there's no beef, there's nothing clean happening here, there's no Passover happening for him. He's now feeding the pigs, the worst thing that ever happened, wallowing with them. The pigs, the dirt, the filth is now covering him. This guy's reaching the lowest of the low. And verse 17, but when he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired men have more than enough bread, but I'm dying here with hunger? I'll get up, I will go to my father, and I'll say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son, and make me one of your hired men. As he got up and came to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion for him and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Verse 21. So this boy, in the depth of his darkest hour, it says, and he came to his senses. What do you think he had when he had nothing? He still had a couple of things, didn't he? He had nothing, he had no money, he's looking after the pigs, he's in the worst. I mean, do you think he'd be proud to tell his dad, Dad, I actually looked after the pigs in the pigsty? This guy had shame. This boy had guilt. I mean, who here has ever had shame and guilt? How hard is it to put your hand up and say, man, I'm sorry, I was wrong? You know, how many relationships here have been broken? The guilt, the pain, the suffering, and the relationships still haven't been mended. This boy's looking after the pigs in the worst place he could ever be, and it says, and he came to his senses. What did he have left? He had free choice left, didn't he? So he still had free choice left. How important is free choice? In fact, Christ's death on the cross was there for us so that we could exercise our free choice. So he still had free choice. He also had the memory of the love of the Father, didn't he? He's in the pig pen. He's got a memory of what it was like. He's got a memory of the good old days, riding those big stallions with the biggest coats that he's got on, telling the boys, oh, you go and do that, you go and do that, you go, you know. Must have felt a lot like Grant, I'd say. You know, the paddocks go forever, the grass is green, it's easy money, the cows continue to breed. I'd say it was a lot like living out the back end of Whangarei there. So he's got these two things left and he goes back. And what's the first thing he says? He says, Father, I've sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. I want to bring you to this point of worthy to be called your son. Why did the son say that? Was the son worthy to be called the son of the Father? Was the son worthy? I hear a few no's, but I want to counter that with a yes. What makes you a son of a father? Behaviour? Does your behaviour or lack of behaviour or good behaviour make you the son of the Father? Or does the blood flowing through the veins make you the son of the Father? If he did a DNA test on the son and a DNA test on the Father, is the bloodline the same? Can the son actually say, you're not my father? Can he can say it, but does it make it real? Was the son worthy to be called the son of the Father? Of course he was, because the Father's blood flowed through his veins. Too often as Christians, as Adventists, when we get rules, when we get laws, it's behaviour that dictates whether we are worthy. But in the prodigal son, does behaviour allow you to be worthy, to be called the son of the Father? Does the Father say, you're not my son? Does the Father say, what have you done with my money? Does the Father say, what were you getting up to down there? Does the Father say that? No. Guilt and shame. When we do things wrong, we think we can't go to the Father. We think we can't go and pray to the Father. Because that's what the devil wants us to think. You're not good enough. No, you can't do that. No, you've done that. No, that's too bad to be forgiven. What is the Father? How does the Father? Now remember, this is a spiritual story. We know it's not a real story. It's a spiritual story because the last verse in the chapter says, my son was dead, but now he's alive. But the son never died. The son was never dead. Spiritually, he was dead. He was dead spiritually, but not physically. So we know there's a spiritual story. So when Jesus said to the disciples to pray, "Our Father which art in heaven," we're talking about a father here. Who did everyone know that Jesus is talking about? This is a story about God, isn't it? It's a spiritual story about God. And what is your picture of God? To the Jews, what was your picture? To the sinners, what is your picture? Jesus was trying to paint a picture of who God is. The Jews, it was all about rules and law. But for Jesus, what did the Father say when the Son comes back? The Son goes, "I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired men." Verse 22, "But the Father said to his slaves, 'Quickly, bring out the best robe, put it on, put a ring on his hand, sandals on his feet.'" Is there any condemnation? Is there any you're not welcome? Is there any you're not allowed here? Is there any you've had your share, it's all over? We don't read any of this. And this is a picture of God the Father to each one of us, because the same people in verse 1 are the same people sitting in this congregation. There's a few tax collectors or sinners, you know. There's a few Pharisees, I think, possibly. I'm a Pharisee, so I'll talk about myself. Might be a few scribes, probably a few sinners. So when the story is told, the story is for us to understand the spiritual implications. The Father runs to him. He sees him. He feels compassion, and he embraced him. When he saw the Son coming back to how he left, do you think the Son came back the same as he left? The same good-looking, strapping boy, clean? No. We know he came back from the pig pen, didn't he? When the Father reached out and he has compassion, and he reaches out and embraces him and touches the Son, when he wraps his arm around him, what's the Son covered in from the pig pens? The dirt, the filth, the everything that the pigs do. That's how the Son came to the Father. That's what he's got on him. He smells, he stinks, he might not even have any clothes. He probably sold the best robe he had. The Father embraces him. What happens to the dirt that's on the Son? Where does the dirt on the Son go when the Father embraces him? Now the Father's dirty, isn't he? The Father embraces him. It's like Jesus with the disciples before he was killed. He takes his robe off. He takes his loincloth. He cleans the disciples' feet and in so makes himself dirty. The Roman soldier gets the robe. We know when he dies, the robe gets out. There's lots that are cast. The Roman soldier gets to put the robe on. There must be something that's important about a robe. Can we go to Isaiah 61:10? Isaiah 61:10. "I will rejoice greatly in the Lord. My soul will exult in my God, for he has clothed me with garments of salvation. He has wrapped me with a robe of righteousness. A bridegroom decks himself with garland as a bride adorns herself with her jewels." What's the spiritual significance of a robe? Garments of salvation. And he has wrapped me with a robe of righteousness. So when the Father takes this, Jesus knew the Pharisees knew the Old Testament. They knew Isaiah. When he says the Father takes his robe off and puts it on his Son, what is the robe? The robe of salvation, the robe of righteousness. So the Father doesn't reply to the Son. He gives him the robe without condemnation. Now, when the Son puts this robe on, what's the significance of the Son putting the robe on? When people look from a distance and they see someone wearing this robe, who do they think he is? He looks like the Father. He's got this robe. Now, he's put this robe of righteousness on. The Father has said it's okay. The Father has said, welcome home. What is all this about? The Father welcomed the relationship, didn't he? There was a broken relationship. The Father wasn't interested in the rules. The Father was interested in the relationship. And we see that with the older son as we come through to the older son. The older son says, who is this son of yours? Doesn't even say it's my brother. And the Father says, everything I have is yours. I just want you to be part of the family. It's all about relationship to the Father. Not about what you have done, not about what you haven't done. It's about the relationship. He then gives him a ring and sandals. Now, sandals separated you from the slaves. So when he gets the sandals on, there's a separation now from the normal servants and the slaves. When he gives them the ring means you can now transact on behalf of the family. Remember with Daniel, remember as we read through the ring, they would put the ring in, and that was the seal of the deal, and they would put it into the wax. When you got the ring, you could now transact on behalf of the family again. When you wore the sandals mean you're not a servant or a slave, you're now the son of the Father. The robe coming from the Father to the Son was the robe of righteousness. It's as if you never were. It's as if you never did it. We get to start fresh. My Son has returned. How often do we look at that today as a story for us and see it the same way? You know, how often when our children muck up a bit, oh no, I wish they never did that. Oh, what are they going to think? And then when it gets even worse than that, well, he's not even welcome in my home anymore. How do we handle relationship when we act like that to our own children? What do our children then think as they move on, as they go for their journey? It's interesting that there's no time mentioned here. It doesn't say, and the son went, and 1 week later he came back. And the son went, and 2 years later he came back. And the son went, and 10 years later he came back. There's no time frame. There's no time frame because everybody's journey is different, and everybody's time frame is different. There are actions, there is a way that the Father's acted. In fact, it's very interesting that there are 3 times the word servant is used in this chapter. And that is once when the son, younger son, comes back and says, Father, I want to serve you, I want to be one of the servants. The second time is mentioned is when the father says to the servant, go and kill the fatted calf. The third time is mentioned is when the older son says, but Father, I have served you all my life. They are 3 different Greek words. They have 3 different meanings. The first one is doulos. So when you go to the original Greek, for when the son comes back, the son's got a picture of what a servant is. And his picture is doulos in the original Greek, which means obedience, it's mythos. Mythios, a wage earner, hired man, servant, paid for work done. So when the young son looked at being a servant, it was just to get a job done, get a wage, and I'll be better off if I can work for my dad. The next one is doulos, when the father says to his servant. So the way the father pictured a servant is doulos. Obedience, devotion, worshipper of God, voluntary, one entirely consumed at the will of the other. There's unity in their decision-making process. And the older son, when he says, Father, I've served you all my life, it's doulio in the original Greek. And that means a slave under bondage, rules and laws, serves from obligation, subjection, deprived of freedom. They all had a different picture of what a servant was. The father's picture of a servant was we're entirely at the will of each other. There's free choice. Let's do it together. The son thinks it's about getting paid for a job, the younger son. The older son's picture is I'm a slave. I'm subjected to slavery. I've got no other way forward. I don't even want to be here. Yet the older son actually stayed. And I suppose just in finishing, I wanted to ask a question. Who are you in the story? Because the story was given for us today. That's why we've actually got it to share. When we spiritualize the story, who are you actually in the story? Are you the person who the younger son went to work for in the pig pens? Do you act that way? Are you the younger son? Have you been on a journey? Are you on a journey? Are you going on a journey? Do you have a child who is on that journey? Are you the older brother? I don't want a bar of what he's been up to. We were never told what the younger son did, but the older son obviously made some accusation. Wild woman, drunkenness. You know, where did the older son actually want to be? He probably wanted to be with the younger son. But there's no way he was going to leave. But man, that's not my brother. You know, that's your son. Who are you actually in the story? And I just want to finish on a couple of little quotes. By the elder son were represented the unrepenting Jews of Christ's day and also the Pharisees in every age who look with contempt upon those whom they regard as publicans and sinners. Because they themselves have not gone to great excess and vice, they are filled with self-righteousness. Christ met these cavaliers on their own ground. Like the elder son in the parable, they had enjoyed special privileges from God. They claimed to be God's sons in God's house, but they had the spirit of the hireling. They were working not from love, but from hope of reward. In their eyes, God was an exacting taskmaster. They saw Christ inviting publicans and sinners to receive freely the gift of His grace, the gift which the rabbis hoped to secure only by toil and penance, and they were offended. The prodigal's return, which filled the father's heart with joy, only stirred them to jealousy. What assurance here of God's willingness to receive the repenting sinner. Have you chosen your own way? Have you wandered far from God? Have you sought to feast upon the fruits of transgression, only to find them turned to ashes upon your lips? And now your substance spent, your life plans thwarted, and your hopes dead. Do you sit alone and desolate? Now that voice which has long been speaking to your heart, but to which you would not listen, comes to you distinct and clear. Return to your father's house. He invites you, saying, Return to me, for I have redeemed you. Do not listen to the enemy's suggestion to stay away from Christ until you have made yourself better, until you are good enough to come to God. If you wait until then, you will never come. When Satan points to your filthy garments, repeat the promise of Jesus, Him that cometh to me I will no wise cast out. Tell the enemy that the blood of Jesus Christ cleanses from all sin. Make the prayer of David your own. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I'll be whiter than snow. And I guess that's what I wanted to share with you this morning, the good news of the gospel. When it comes to the picture of the prodigal son, how do we treat our children? How do we treat the young children in our church? How do we look at ourselves? Because we haven't really done anything wrong, does it make us righteous? No, it doesn't. We're all equal. We're all equal here. And the big thing that jumps out is of the sheep, the 1 in 100, the coins, 1 in 10, and the sons, 1 out of 2, is that there's a celebration when it's found, when the son is found, when the coin is found, there's a celebration. Number 2, the relationship is what matters. The relationship is being restored. The relationship is what mattered to the Father. And I suppose I just wanted to share a little story just as we finish, which I think sums up for each one of us the relationship of the Father to each one of us, no matter what journey we've been on. And this was a poem. There was a bookkeeper in Wellington, and he was doing up some old books, very old books. And in one of the books, he actually found a handwritten note called A Soldier's Prayer. And he actually, after reading it, loved it so much that he actually hung it up on his wall and then published it. And this was the soldier's prayer. Look, God, I've never spoken to you before, but now I want to say, how do you do? You see, God, they told me you didn't exist, and like a fool I believed all this. Last night from a shell hole I saw your sky. I figured right then they had told me a lie. Had I taken the time to see things you made, I'd have known they weren't calling a spade a spade. I wonder, God, if you'd shake my hand. Somehow I feel that you will understand. Funny I had to come to this hellish place before I had time to see your face. Well, I guess there isn't much more to say, but I'm sure, God, I met you today. I guess the 0 hour will soon be here. The signal, well, God, I'll have to go. I like you lots, this I want you to know. Look now, this will be a horrible fight. Who knows, I may come to your house tonight. Though I wasn't friendly to you before, I wonder, God, if you'd wait at your door. Look, I'm crying, me shedding tears. I wish I had known you all these many years. Well, I have to go now, God. Goodbye. And now, since I've met you, I'm not afraid to die. And the next day he died. I guess that little prayer from a soldier who didn't know God as he should, didn't know God as he wanted, is the story of all of us at one time. That prayer, God, I've made a mistake. And instead of the shame and guilt of I can't go back, knowing that as a father, no matter what it is, you want your children home no matter what. So yeah, just thought I'd share that with you today. And thank you very much for all listening.